Okay, it's time for another edition of How to Get Into. This is a video series that I love to do that kind of takes a little bit of a deeper look at a discography of a full band or artist. It allows me to talk about their career overall without having to like rank them or talk about which one's better than the other ones. And I don't run into the fear of them releasing another album anytime soon, which would essentially, if I was doing a worst to best, would outdate it in a very quick manner. And I know that Mastodon has another album down the turnpike, so I wanted to have a quick look as I was getting into their full discography and talk about it. I've been a huge fan of Mastodon for quite a while. It took me a little bit of time to get into. Like when I first started listening to their stuff, I wasn't quite as much of a fan. I was already into other acts like Between the Buried and Me and Opeth that utilize more of like a death metal aspect to like a progressive metal outlook, but I always found that Mastodon was a little too harsh for me, a little too gripping and grimy for me. Like they definitely put the sludge in the sludge metal. It took me a while to get used to their shorter, punchier, more cohesive tracks when compared to those bands that I already mentioned. But once I kind of got into their more rugged, bombastic, relentless playing style with this overarching, almost like sludge metal expression behind it, it opened up the door for a lot of other bands that I have subsequently come to love. And Mastodon still has a number of their albums that I look back extremely fondly of. So this gave me a chance to get into their whole discography and talk about some of their albums. So what I'm going to do with this is I'm going to give you kind of lay out their albums in almost like a roadmap of like, this is where I would start if you're a new individual to Mastodon. This is also where I feel some of their greatest material has been written. From there, I go to like next steps of if you like those, this is where we go to. If you like certain aspects of the band, this is where you can go to get more of those or try something a little bit different. And then from there, I'll finish off with a few like proceed with caution, fans only. If you're really connecting with this music, here are some further readings, kind of an idea. So that's kind of like the basic bones of this. So a couple things right off the get-go with any of these. Obviously, this is my own subjective opinion. I'm not saying this is the hard and fast roadmap whenever listening to Mastodon as a new individual. This is just my own personal experience and my own personal way of navigating their albums. I'm also not going to be giving a large full scope album review. I'm just going to give like very broad brush strokes and maybe a little bit of context of what to expect when coming into these albums, and maybe some highlights here and there, like some things to look out for. And I think really that's about it. So without further ado, let's dive into Mastodon's discography. And I'm also going to include some of their EPs in here, which I'm really excited to talk about. So yeah, let's dive in. So first up, obviously the first two albums that are a must go to first off the bat is definitely their second album of Leviathan, as well as their fourth album of Crack the Sky. These are my two favorite records from them. They hold brilliant music. Both of them are concept albums, which are great. In fact, I believe the first like 4 albums from them tackle a different aspect of reality in terms of like earth, fire, water, and ether. I don't think they've done air yet to my there's a little bit of an argument to be made about Emperor of Sand, but anyway, so obviously Leviathan is the big concept album based on Moby Dick. It is a mastodon of sound in really interpreting the novel that is Moby Dick into a metal album. I mean, the album itself opens up with a punch with Blood and Thunder. My favorite track is the massive track, the 13 and a half minutes Hearts Alive. The final chugging guitar on that, really keep your ears open for that one, as it really does explode. This shows that they're not just your typical average American sludge metal. They really are a progressive band in blending very thoughtful harmonies. And similarly with Crack the Sky, now we're dealing more with the ether, with what is creativity, what is reality, how is one like soul interacting with the world around them. And this one has some of my favorite tracks. Like they have 2 tracks that are pretty lengthy, the first one being the Tsar, as well as the Last Baron, and both of these have just dropping That's a fun word to say. Moments in terms of like the dual guitar works and everybody coming together to provide massive soundscapes. And this is also where we have 3 individuals singing and not just 2. So Brent, Troy, and Bran. Bran is the first time singing on this one, and he will actually go on to have some tracks where he's singing solo. And so it's allowing these guys to kind of pass the baton between themselves and create some really interesting 3-part harmonies within the concept of this sludgy metal project. And it provides this otherworldly ethereal soundscapes that really play with your noodle, and it is trippy, it is acid rock, it is all these really meaty things when it comes to this style of music. And honestly, Crack the Sky is an absolute masterpiece, as well as Leviathan. I think both of these could be listened by almost anybody that enjoys music and get something out of it. So those would be my first 2 starting points. With this, I would also honestly include their EP that is Cold Dark Place. This is probably my favorite project from them. Maybe not my favorite album because it's an EP and there's only 4 tracks, but honestly, this is Mastodon at their most intimate and vulnerable, as well as their most brilliant. It really does summarize a lot of the concepts that were on past albums in terms of dealing with death, in terms of grief. It showcases their best music to date. So honestly, if nothing else, check out Cold Dark Place. It is kind of the perfect starting point for the band as well. If you're not a big fan of that sludge, grating metal, I think it's a great place to kind of start to dip your toes into this without committing for a full-length album. So if you're a big fan of that more experimentation, kind of trippy, almost like stoner rock at this point, like they're testing the boundaries, they're adding a lot of different overlays and a lot of different things to their sounds, and it's not just straight up metal, I would go to their last 2 albums next, which is Once More Around the Sun and Emperor of Sand. Once More Around the Sun isn't necessarily a concept album. Like most of their albums are concept albums, aside for their first one, The Hunter, and Once More Around the Sun. It is more of just like a collection of songs that can flow narratively through the story, kind of, as well as Emperor of Sand, which is much more of a full-length concept album about grief, about dying, about accepting one's own mortality and the mortality of others, especially when those others mean so much to you, and the suffering that you see someone go to, and actually having death as be a release, as being almost a looked forward to aspect of it. It's kind of dark and morbid in that sense, but Emperor of Sand really does hold some of my favorite music. And honestly, both Once More Around the Sun and Emperor of Sand have some of my favorite Mastodon tracks. The only problem is, because they're a little bit more on the lengthy side, there are a few moments on both of these albums that do land flat, unfortunately, and sometimes that's their like singles, like Show Yourself from Emperor of Sand's probably one of their weaker tracks, even though they led the album with this one, as well as The High Road. Like The High Road is from Once More Around the Sun, and it's an all right track, but when you're getting things like the title track, Chimes at Midnight, Asleep in the Deep on Once More Around the Sun, as well as Stormbringer, Roots Remain, Word to the Wise, and Jaguar God from Emperor of Sand, these tracks really do showcase the brilliance that is Mastodon in more of their later careers, or I guess midpoint if they continue on, but at least where we're standing now. They're punchy, they're memorable, they have these really soaring guitar works, and the guitar works really of Brent Hines and Bill Kelleher. Both of these guys on their guitar works really do showcase some brilliant play works, and how they're able to interweave between one another really showcase something really special. So this would be where I would go if you're more into like kind of a proggy approach, more experimental in terms of what these sounds can do. You don't really care all that much for like that really heavy hitting, relentless metal. In that case, if that is something that you're looking for, I would look at their first album of Remission, as well as Blood Mountain. Blood Mountain is more of a like full-on concept album about essentially climbing up and overcoming crazy adversities, but getting lost along the way. Like getting yourself to, like if we use that whole Blood Mountain of like getting yourself to the peak of this mountain and surveying the land and just being horrified of all the like being lost in the woods and being run at for crazy creatures and all that like really grating stuff and just the horrors as well as the beauty that's found within it, then yeah, Blood Mountain is fantastic. And I think originally they were planning to have it flow more like Crack the Sky as being like one continuous piece, but in the end we get these slotted works that kind of fit towards an overall whole. And if we're going to hold the elements, this is more of like the earth element, so it's unbending, relentless. You can't really manipulate it. You can only hope that it doesn't kill you along the way. And so it really does provide that massive sound, that really heavy hitting stuff. And there's a little bit of experimentation. I do enjoy the fact that they include a little bit of like the synths on there just to provide some really interesting soundscapes on there. They're trying a little bit with different vocal things with Blade Catcher, where they almost have this computerized vocal works coming on to providing most of the lyrics on that one. If we talk about Remission a little bit, I think Remission is a really good place to start in like where the band has a lot of their great ideas, because a lot of the tracks on Remission, some of the ideas and some of the concepts that we have on Remission do come in later on Leviathan, Blood Mountain, and Crack the Sky. So it's almost putting down that foundation that these albums would then pick up. And even though it's not really officially a concept album, it does kind of have the essence of Fire on it, just with that energy, that punch. I mean, this was the first album that the boys officially released outside of an EP that I'll get to in a second. But this is also where they like really honed that craft and decided, okay, this is the direction of the band that we want to go in. And in that sense, it's probably their heaviest and at times a little bit harder to get into. Like, it's one of the few albums that I won't spin regularly, but it is one that I will come back to every once in a while when I really want that heavier punch of music. We've already pretty much listed off most of their albums. This is kind of like where to go next. So we have our first stage, our where to go next, depending on what kind of connected with you. This is for if you've connected with this and you really, really enjoy it, now where to go. And really, I want to talk about the only album that I haven't talked about in terms of studio release, like full-length album, and that is The Hunter. I feel like The Hunter upon release was definitely a letdown, because at that point it was the second album that wasn't a concept album. Because I mean, when you come from Leviathan, Blood Mountain, and Crack the Sky, you've kind of laid down the foundation of what it was to be Mastodon, and they decided to kind of break away from this. And I mean, 2011 was a very strange time for progressive rock, especially for the big names. Like Opeth decided to do away with the screams. Dream Theater, like Mike Portnoy had left, and Mike Mangini came on, and for Steven Wilson, he was done with Porcupine Tree and just released his second solo album, and he was like, this is where all my time is going to be now. So like 2011 was a really strange year, and I might actually have to do a video about that. And so Mastodon kind of followed suit, and this one is a lot more experimentation. It's less of a full-on sludge metal and more of a progressive metal outfit. As I mentioned, it's not a full concept album, and they kind of released two editions of this album, the regular edition and then the extended edition. And yeah, so the songs do waver a little bit, like there's no real cohesive whole, and it is a little bit of a mixed grab bag, so know that going into this, but it still holds some of my favorite songs from Mastodon. And in fact, this is one of those albums that, even though I can honestly say it's not my favorite album from them, it's probably the album that got the most listens from me, just for how strange and how odd it is in comparison to the rest of their works. There's no real standout track on here outside of maybe their first two tracks of Black Tongue and Curl the Barrel. I do really enjoy The Octopus Has No Friends, so that would be one that I would say, if you're into this and you want something different, or perhaps you didn't really connect with any of the albums I've already mentioned, maybe try The Hunter. Maybe The Hunter is up for you. But this isn't one that I would necessarily say approach with caution. This is just one that maybe give it a try. If you're not connecting or you're like really loving it, then give it a spin. It still is a really interesting time. So from here, I wanted to talk about their other two EPs outside of Cold Dark Place, and that is Call the Mastodon and Medium Rarities. These would definitely be more of like approach with caution, or like fans only or like completionists. Call to Mastodon is essentially their first real EP, which I believe originally was called like 9 songs or something like that they then remixed and remastered and put out as Call to Mastodon. And it is very different thematically and stylistically to what we would get later on. It is very much a lot more heavy. All of the vocal works on here are either spoken word, like a found footage kind of spoken word, or you're getting that like guttural, screaming, yelling, very bombastic, very grating kind of an idea. And I'm not as big of a fan of this. Like I appreciate the music that's found on this in terms of like, again, very much like Remission, laying the groundwork for where Mastodon is going to go, but I didn't necessarily enjoy this one, and I honestly don't feel myself coming back to it. And same a little bit with Medium Rarities, which was released last year. This is, again, one that is very much a completionist work, as it is essentially just the collection of tracks that they've put out in other areas, like for Game of Thrones, Jonah Hex, and a couple other ones. Like I know that there's a couple of instrumental points on this, as well as covers. Like there's a Feist cover, there's a Flaming Lips cover, there's a Metallica cover, there's a couple live ones, like there's Blood and Thunder, as well as Iron Tusk, and yeah, I mean, it's okay, but again, it doesn't really hold anything substantial. And the other one that I would also say, Stairway to Nick John, which I did have. I picked it up for Record Store Day, but because it's just Stairway to Heaven, once live and once in the studio, I didn't feel all that excited about owning. So if you want to listen to a more metal rendition of Stairway to Heaven, check it out. It wasn't really necessarily for me, so this is probably like the biggest proceed with caution when compared to all their other works. And I think, honestly, I think that's all I've got for Mastodon. I think that's it. There's my roadmap for where and how I would approach their music. And I hope this serves you well. If you haven't already listened to Mastodon, I say give it a try. I mean, there's no harm in giving it a try. At the very worst, you know that there's another band out there that's not for you. But at the very best, you might actually find that this is a style of music that didn't necessarily think you would love, like myself, that you've grown to really appreciate and love. So yeah, that's about it for me for Mastodon. Really looking forward to their next album. I hope I can listen to it soon. But what did you guys think? Where would you put the roadmap for their albums? Which ones do you think are essential that you have to listen to right away? Which ones do you think you can kind of hold off on and not really dive into right away? Let me know about all of that by commenting down below. And if you haven't already, let's try that again. If you like what you see and you want to help support me, consider donating to my Patreon. I've left the link down below for you to check out. Even $1 a month really does go a long way. You get perks like having your name at the end of my videos, as well as video callouts and whatnot. Check out my podcast, Quid Pro Quo. I've left a link down below that you can check out the YouTube page where I put up all the visuals for that, as well as the full-length podcast episode, and you can just listen to it on your podcast, wherever you find your podcast. And even though I've kind of let it slip for a while, I hope to pick it back up. There's my tabletop role-playing game channel that you can check out as well. And yeah, I think that's about it. Yeah. All right. So thank you guys so much for watching. As always, you guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.